Hey everybody, this is Carl again, coming to you from Tabletop Tango. Missing my partner in crime Eric today because he's been sick, and so I know everybody's waiting to see that detailed combat example. But instead, I figured I would continue on talking a little bit about API scripting and Roll20 just to keep the momentum going. So let's go ahead and bring up my scripting pane here. So let's go into Roll20 and talk about doing some more scripting. So the first thing though, let's remind ourselves that in order to get to the scripting panel, we are going to go into our game and then we click on API scripts, and that will bring up the scripting panel, which I have an example here. So it fires up and you get the API console, you get all your scripts defined here. And then that's what you need to do there. So what are we going to do today? Well, today I want to show more about events, and I want to show about state management. And so we have a set of tokens here that we've defined in our system, and we want to do something interesting and go beyond what I did in the first video, which was just take a command, do something based on what the command did. Now I want to do something with my tokens when something happens to them. So in this case, I thought, hey, it would be interesting. We never want to split the party, right? Never want to split the party. So I'm going to create a script that sort of remembers all these tokens that are together and moves them as a group. And so I've already got the script defined, but I'll show you what the functions are we're trying to do. So we got the concept of grouping. And so once we group them, they all move together as a unit. And when we also can we define something that says, well, what if the folks are dead? Do we really want them to follow us anymore? No, we're going to say leave the dead. And if leave the dead true, the dead doesn't come along with us anymore. So we can turn that back, toggle that back to false. And now the dead comes with us. Now, if we don't want that anymore, we're going to clear it out. And then none of these folks are following each other anymore. So that's a nice script. It does something useful, something interesting. But the question is, how are we going to make that script? Now, this is more sophisticated than the one that we did before, the first one. The first one we had just responding to commands. And so when we responded to commands, we did something, and then that was it. Now we have to handle when these move events happen and things like that are going on. So let's take a look at what kind of script we would do to make that happen. So first things first, we have that same standard kind of setup that we did and we talked about in the first video, and we went much more in depth in why this structure is used. But just as a reminder, we have this variable, which is a function. And in the function, we have a number of variables, all which are functions, or in this case, functions. And again, in JavaScript, a variable can hold a function. We have a number of those functions that do all the work, and then at the end we do and I went too far, or did I not? In the end we do a return of a structure that has a couple of the functions, our keys check install and our register event handlers, and then on ready, which is an event that says when the campaign comes up and everything's ready to go, fire this event. And so we fire this event, and then we're going to do our check install, and then we register our event handlers. And here's where the sophistication comes in. Originally, we had one event handler handling user input, but now we're going to respond to when the graphic changes. So when it moves, part of the parameters within it change, specifically its top location and its left location. And then we're also going to handle a destroy graphic. And that's because what happens if we remove one of our tokens that is in our token, our list of tokens that are following each other around, we have to handle that gets destroyed and update our sort of our list that we're managing. So if you want to learn more about this structure, go ahead and look at episode 5 of Tabletop Tango, where I kind of go into this kind of more in depth. So let's take a look at this script and what it does. So when we get a chat message, as we did on our event, we're going to have our handle input, and it's just like before. Is it an API? If so, we can do some work. We split on spaces. We get our parameter. If it's follow me around, again with the exclamation point, got to keep checking that. We're going to do our work. because it's for us, and we shift the parameter again to get our next, get that command. If it's help, we just help. If it's group, like I showed, we're going to group the tokens. If it's clear, we're going to clear those tokens. And if it's leave behind, we're just toggling the leave behind. So let's take a look at when the check install happens. So that first function that gets called, we need to manage state. And so how are we going to manage state? Because we want to keep our list of tokens that are doing work or are following each other around from execution, execution, execution. And we don't want to forget that. So Roll20 provides a variable called state. And that contains global persistent information. And to start storing things, I go ahead and I create kind of a sub-item that has my namespace in it. And the reason I do that is this is shared by every script. It's unlikely any script will use this name, and so I can feel confident that nobody's stepping over my information that I've defined. So my standard practice is just use the name of my script. So first thing we're going to do, though, is check to see if that state variable exists. So again, check install is called first, and we want to get a little more sophisticated and say if it exists, does not exist, I'm going to create it. And I'm going to create it with a version number, and I'm going to use an object because I want to store more than one thing. And why the version number is, well, let's say you update your script and you add more sophistication and there's more variables, or you want to redefine how a variable is used. You can check the version of the state and then modify it to be updated to your current standard that you think is right. So let's go and once we have that, then we go ahead and we're going to set another property, leave the dead. Now, obviously, I can set it right with this full variable, but I'm going to create a helper function that makes my life a little easier called setProperty, and I'll show you that because it'll show how that state variable is managed. So I pass in a key and I pass in a value, and so the first thing I do is I take the current value, so here's our state, follow me around, key, and I set that to the current value. And the reason for that is I'm going to return it later so that anything that calls setProperty and sets the property can also use the old value, and there may be a reason for that. I changed it. Here's the old value. I need to do something with the old value. Maybe I'm comparing it to my new value and doing something else. And then I set that key value and the object to the value. And that's basically what it is. Obviously, you could do that all in line. You don't need a helper function. I like helper functions. And then to get the property, I'd pass the key in and I do the same thing. I get the current value based on follow me around that key. If that key doesn't exist, we're going to get an undefined, and we can return, and we're going to return what it is. And so you should check when you get that return whether it's undefined, and if it is, maybe we do some default value. You won't see me doing that because I'm very careful at making sure that this stuff is going on. Well, you may see me do it. So our first command that we defined after our help is group. And group is what we're going to use to tell all the tokens that, and I showed that before, tell all the tokens that are part of my group that's going to walk around together as a unit. Now remember in the first kind of video, episode 5, we talked about all the message pieces that are coming in. So when we get called, our handle input, we get a message, and that object, one of the things it contains is message.selected. And that contains all of the items that were selected on the screen at the time that the message was typed. So we pass that into our set group, and we go down to our set group. And so what we're doing is we get that list of tokens, all that were passed in. If it's null, then we don't care and we just drop out. But then we're going to create a token list. So we're going to keep our tokens in an array. Our list of tokens we want to deal with is just going to be an array. And so for each one of those we passed in, the selected, we're going to do some work. First thing we're going to do is get the object. And remember the API, again, of Roll20, and we talked about this before, has a command called getObject. And what you pass in is you pass the type of object and the token you're trying to get. And so for each one of these tokens we get, we have a type and an ID. So we get the first class object from that values that are passed in. And then I check if the subtype is token. If it is, then I'm going to do some work. So I'm going to push the token object ID into our list. So we'll use get, which remember on an object, get, you give it a parameter ID or a parameter name, and it'll pull that in. In this case, I'm giving it ID. And for these that are underscore, if we look at our API and our objects, so here's our graphic object. If we go ahead and look at that, we can see here's all the values. Now these with the underscore, you don't have to use the underscore when you're calling them, and that's why this looks like I'm just doing the ID. So I add them in. So every one of these that passed in, I add it to my list, and then at the end I set that property tokens with the list. So now I have this value that I can pull in when it's time to do work. And so speaking of doing work, we have this message, change graphic. So when a graphic changes, we're going to call our function handle move. And so one of the things that's changing is our top or left or rotation when I move an object, and so this will fire. And so if we go and take a look at our handle move, we get an object and we get the previous object. So if we take a look at our API documentation and we look at events, and we go down to change graphic, which is what we're looking at, that's what gets passed in, but they're different. So object is a first class object where we use that get parameter name to get that parameter or get that value. And previous is just a kind of basic, doesn't respond to get, it's just you look it up. You put in that value that you're pulling out. Those are different things because this is no longer, the previous is no longer a first class Roll20 object, and so you need to access it separately. So that's what we do here. You can see that we go delta left, we get the left property, and we subtract off the previous, delta top, delta rotation. So this is the change, the delta or change that happened. And what we do first is we then look to see, are those all 0? Then we're going to return because there's nothing for me to do. The token we moved did not actually move. Nothing happened there. So if that's not true, we go ahead and for each one of these tokens in our list, we're going to go ahead and get it. So we're looking it up by that get object. It's a graphic, and we have the token ID. So we have all the information we need to get the first class token. First thing we do then, now that we have that, is we're also, remember we set that property leave the dead, or leave dead. If that's defined, if that's true, meaning it's true, we're going to leave the dead, and the status marker of this is dead, which remember in the first video we talked about it, the X, its value is dead. So if those status we get the status markers, if it's dead, it's not equal to -1, which means it's in there. We're not going to do anything, and just for sake of showing people how things work, I have a log message. Obviously in your production script, you are not going to have all these log messages. So it's not dead, and we're not leaving the dead. We get here, and then the next thing we do is we check to see if this token, the object of the token that got passed in, the one that moved, is equal to the one off the list. If it is equal, we're just not doing anything. If it's not equal, then we go ahead and we do these deltas. So the object, we're going to add in all those changes, and then we're going to use set. We did get to get the object, and we're going to use set to modify the object. So now every time we move, we go through, we get the delta, the change, we set the change to all the other tokens on our list, and then Roll20 will make that move. So that's how we handle that function. Or that event. So here's an event, we handled it, and then last but not least, I mentioned, well, what happens if I erase one? Well, now we've got another event called destroy.graphic, and what that passes in, and we'll go to our handle destroy, what that passes in is the object, and this is the first class object that got passed in. So our token ID, we go object.get ID, so now we have that object. We're going to go get our token list, get that property, that list of tokens, and then we're going to create a new list that's empty. If the token list does not include the one that got passed in, so the one that got deleted is not on our list anyway, we don't care what we return. If it is, we're going to loop through all of the tokens on our list, and when we hit that token, we're not going to push it back, or push it onto the list. Every other one will push on the list, and when we're done, we have our new token list, and we set our property to this new list. that no longer has the one that's got deleted. There's other ways of doing this, but it's a little more illustrative to actually show the for each and what it's doing. So there we go. Chat message allowed us to make modifications to the state. We can group, we can clear, we can say, hey, follow, not, and that's sort of getting input from the user. Our change graphic is every time something changes, we're going to handle it. And then destroy, every time the graphic gets destroyed or deleted, we're going to handle that and make sure that our list integrity is great. So that's kind of the basics of doing a little more advanced work in scripting. We keep our state between runs. Now we have state so that the party will always stay together even if we start over again. But then, of course, we can clear it. We have our change graphic so that when the move happens, the other graphics follow. And then we have destroy so that when one of the graphics disappears, it goes away. So now just to remind ourselves how we execute these scripts, always, as I said, always keep in your editor all your edits, and then what we do is we select everything, we copy it, we go into our script panel that we opened earlier, we paste it, and then we save that script, and we can see that the console restarts up, and our command is executing. Never make changes in here. I mean, you can, it's your choice, but things will get out of sync. So make changes in your editor, saved on your hard drive, copy it over here and execute it. Makes life really easy, and you don't change that. So now we're executing it. Again, we have our script set up. Oh, we're not following, so we can go ahead and do a group. Now everybody's following the leader. We can say, well, but we don't want leave the dead. We don't want the dead to come along with us. They're dead. We don't care anymore. Done. We have our nice little script. Does some real work. Is more sophisticated. It's getting more sophisticated than just a basic script. Now there's a script in the library that does something very similar to this, much more sophisticated, but this is an example, and maybe you have just a little thing you want to do that makes your life easier, like make them dead. It's just a little script from episode 5 that just made my life a little easier, and it doesn't have to be too sophisticated, but it made my life easier. So hopefully this was valuable and taught you something about scripting a little bit more than maybe you knew before, a little more in depth. Hopefully Eric starts feeling better, and we can get back to doing some deep dive on some tabletop gaming ideas, concepts, and take it from there. So again, thanks for watching, and if I think of other things to learn on the API, I'll go ahead and do a video. Thanks. Bye.